Okay, I'm hoping that you all can see the screen as I've got it up here right now. I suspect I'll hear quickly if I don't. But I wanted to start out with a little bit about me that's not available if you go and do a Google search. And generally, these are a lot about my philosophy in terms of what I consider to be the database development arena. I'm a big fan of making sure data is exploited and leveraged. I like to make sure that when I've collected data for an application, if an application is doing transaction processing and it generates data, that we find ways to really make it useful for my business organization or my government organization. How do I really get a lot of value out of that data? So I have to say I'm not a big fan of the word governance around data, because to me governance sometimes implies that the data is kind of rate limited or governed and can't be used. I realize that's not the general term for it, but in a lot of ways I like to encourage people to explore and use data. So I like to make sure that it's usable by a lot of people and accessible by a lot of people. I really like algorithms and data structures. I really am fascinated by making sure that the data structures that we instantiate within our databases are useful and can accomplish a lot of different things. Can they be used to solve problems? Are they amenable to the processing algorithms that our application people want to use? And that's why I've got the book on the right that one of my favorite books from computer science back in the day is the Data Structures and Algorithms book, because I found that fascinating. I think databases and data at rest is a logical extension of what I would call data in use. Many application developers I work with really, once the data has been captured and recorded and stored, they're not as interested in it unless it's being used to render something on screen. Whereas I think there's actually a lot of rich value in data that what happened last month, what happened last year. So I really like the idea that you can leverage more of your historical data. So I think a data model that helps support that is very useful. And then finally, the bottom one is basically a statement about how lazy I am. I don't like writing stuff. If there's a way to automate something, I really want to figure out how to do that. And I hope to show you some ideas on how to automate your database development activities on the next few slides that'll help you feel the same way. So I'll jump right into it. The presentation, in a lot of ways, comes from my evolution of understanding what a DBA is and what they do. And I think it's because a DBA is in a difficult position in many organizations. First off, the title is suggestive of their role, and I don't particularly like that. I don't particularly like the fact that they're described as an administrator. I think a DBA often takes a more active role in how data is used and shaped within an organization. So unfortunately, though, they wear a lot of hats, and because of that, they get shot at, I think, from a lot of different directions. They have an operations focus. Most DBAs are assigned to a production operations organization. It's relatively rare in my experience to have a DBA outside of operations. And so they're hit with the following things from the business and government owners, right? Is the database backed up? Is it replicating to our DR site? Have you been maintaining space so we don't run out of space on our tables? We need to make another copy of it for some analysis purposes or for testing. So get on making a clone copy for me, and oh, by the way, of course, make sure it's fast. So we're going to yell at you whenever there's something slow. It's clearly the database, and you need to deal with it. They have another role, and this might be the data governance type role, where they're attached to or associated with the data architecture group at many companies, and they're then required to help participate in producing a data model, ensuring that the database objects follow naming standards so that the data is discoverable within an organization. They may be responsible for maintaining a master data catalog so that you can understand if we're representing people or customers in our organization, what is the table name, what systems are those located in, how do I get at that data, and then always is a never-ending battle against data quality. How do I ensure that what's getting in the fields is what's supposed to be in the fields? So it's not necessarily a surprise sometimes that the stuff on the left here, which is traditional database development type activities, are often getting short shrift from the overworked and overwhelmed DBA. That honestly, a lot of times this is their last priority. I do it to support development, but I'm really getting hit on the stuff on the right. I'm measured on the stuff on the right and at the bottom, so I may not be the best person always to handle the stuff on the left. So I often tell people, I think one challenge to start off the bat is when you have a DBA, maybe you could consider splitting their functionality or their responsibilities among 3 different kinds of people. You have the administrator or the operator, and oftentimes you want this to be the most conservative person in your organization. You want them to make sure that the database is secure, reliable, it's running, it's up, it's backed up. They're not necessarily the kind of person you want taking risks and figuring out new and interesting ways to store data or manipulate data. You have the governor or the architect, and this is the person who helps communicate out what the data assets are within the company, right? Who has access to the data, where can you find it, is it following standards so we can interoperate and interchange, and oftentimes this is a more of an architect or less of a hands-on type person. And then finally, the area that I think we'd like to really focus and drive in on today is the database developer, or what I call a database engineer. And I think when starting a development project, it's really clear that you want the stuff on the left. You really would like support from someone who can ensure that you're getting database resources allocated, developed, and provisioned as fast as possible so you can get on with the application development. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is, if you have a DBA assigned to your development team, your development project, how can you encourage them, or how can you facilitate their ability to do that? Or what I like to say is, how do I turn that DBA into a DBE, or turn a database administrator into a database engineer? This goes along with the premise that many of you are probably starting down the path of Agile development. So the traditional DBA type role, where you'd sit down and wait for an enterprise data model, that's really not going to happen anymore. You just don't have time for that. You don't have time to wait around for a full enterprise data model to get finished before you can start producing working systems and working code. So my challenge is to many DBAs is, okay, I know you have to do that, but how do you get started? So you've got a brand new database that you've given to a development team. A real good question is, who creates the necessary database objects? Do your developers go in and do it? Do you submit a request to a DBA group that goes and does it? Do I have to produce a model? Do I have to kind of have a plan before I do it? So a lot of people start there. They say, well, what's your data model? And what kind of modeling tool are you using? And what I've seen in many cases, some of you may recognize this, most DBAs probably don't. But what I'm showing you on the right is a data model, if you will. This is an active record pattern from Ruby, from the Ruby on Rails ecosystem. And this is an ability for a Ruby programmer to essentially define a table, right? They define an employees table, they allocate columns to it, they add indexes to it. They have a relatively rich language in the active record pattern in which they have an ability to actually go and define database objects. And I think I found on many smaller teams, this is what's happening. They're going off and they're doing this in a code method that they're more comfortable with. So I know that if you're a DBA in the audience, you're probably looking like the screen guy here and wondering, oh my gosh, you really can't let that happen. You can't let developers tables like that. They don't know what they're doing. They're going to make mistakes. They don't know how to do this or that or the other thing. The challenge, though, is they're probably going to find a way to do that anyway. Especially when they've been given access to a system and you haven't had time to really check in on them. So really what I like to say is, let's assume that that's happening and then figure out a way to prevent them from shooting themselves in the foot. Because quite frankly, the knowledge you bring as a DBA or a database engineer is how can I prevent problems from occurring? How do I ensure that someone, when they do define database objects, they at least do it in a way that's going to be useful and has good performance and won't have a problem when it starts to need to scale. So one of the things I would love to have, and I call this the social development database, and this is probably because I fell asleep at the computer and I had a dream that I was logged into my database, but I also had my Facebook page open on screen. And I saw these kind of status messages go by that Dominic Delmolino created the Scott.empty table. Chris Lee added the ename varchar field to the table. Kevin Patch created the employee stored procedure. And one of my friends likes the fact that I've created that table for them. I actually don't know of any tool that really does this, but in thinking through it, honestly, I really like the idea that as I'm logged into a database and I'm allowing people to create objects, if I'm going to really speed up development and I'm letting lots of different people create the database objects they need to in support of their application modules or functionality, I'd really like to see it as it's happening. And honestly, this isn't necessarily an odd concept. Many version control systems, especially the distributed ones, will show what's going on in terms of people checking in code or doing their work. This is in the bottom right here, I've got a screenshot of GitHub for the Mac, and you can see here, this is the history of check-ins for a particular project, right? It's the master the branch in this case, and you can see everything that someone checks in, who did it, what their comment was when they did it, what time they did it, what the hash code is of that change. So the idea that a database system is similar to a code project in that I can track changes, I can see when people are doing things, is to me very useful. It's a repeatable paradigm. It's what they're doing in the code world. So I'd love to be able to do this in the database world. I don't think it's an unreasonable request to be able to, as a DBA, watch when people are making structural changes in a real-time basis. I mentioned that I don't think there's any particular tool that does this. I've proposed this in a couple places and had people intrigued by it, and I've often told people, if you build this, I will buy it, but I haven't found any yet to date. But the nice thing is, there actually is a way to capture that information. Databases, for the most part, have built-in audit capabilities. Now, it's funny, most people think that the audit trail is used for security people, it's to control access to data, but quite frankly, you can actually turn it on and have it record every structural change to your database. I often get objections to this approach. Usually people say, well, no, we can't touch the audit trail. The audit trail is used by our security organization to ensure that no one logs in as sysdba or that no one accesses employee salaries. So audit's only for security. We don't use it for developers' convenience. And not only that, if you turn this on, we're going to get a real performance hit. Every time someone creates a database object, it's going to log to the audit table, and we can't afford that kind of overhead. Honestly, I don't understand that. To me, I mentioned earlier that I believe data should be exploited by lots of different people. So if there's an ability to capture the data I want, and I'd like to use it, why not turn it on? Why does security get all the fun at watching what's going on in the system? As a development DBA or as a DBA responsible for a development system, I'd love to know, how many tables they created this week, and are they doing that on a regular basis? And I have a funny comment on the performance bit. In my opinion, there shouldn't be an issue with the fact that there's a performance hit every time I create a database object. And the reason I say that is because if I have a transaction that as a result of its transaction, creates 5 tables and then drops them, it's not very efficient. It's not a very good use of the database structure to use the data dictionary essentially as a transaction capability. I want the ability to almost penalize people if they're doing high volume DDL. So in my opinion, the performance hit is actually a good thing. One of the things I like to do in development environments is make bad practices painful. And in my opinion, a development process that relies on rapid DDL should be painful. I don't want that occurring in my system. So I think the performance hit is worth the benefit. The other reason I really like it is when it's turned on, I get this feeling of all-seeing, all-knowing. And I've done this at many of my sites. When I was the director of database development at Network Solutions, I have a team of about 6 database engineers underneath me who were supporting 4 or 5 development teams. And as they were working, I would relatively routinely query the audit log and see who was working on what. And I would go over to their desks and I would say, hey, I saw that you're working on the products table. And they'd jump out of their chair and say, well, how did you know that? And I said, well, I would often just tell them I know everything. And then they get all mystique and awe about my capabilities. But honestly, I was just watching the audit log. And one of the things I also liked about it was I could tell if 2 people were trying to touch the same object, or if they were touching an object that I didn't think was in their area of responsibility. I was curious, and why did you need to touch that package? I thought that we weren't using that package. So it really encouraged discussion about what was going on in the system, because you could almost interpret and anticipate what people were doing. And in the case where you don't have database engineers doing this under your direction, if developers are doing this, I found it fascinating to be able to watch them and say, hey, I noticed you created the table, but you forgot to put the primary key on it. Or I noticed that you added this index, you added a couple single column indexes. Perhaps you were trying to query and needing a multi-column index. So it really, as a database engineering manager, the ability to watch what was going on to me was very powerful. And unfortunately, I haven't seen good tool support for this yet. But it's not all that hard to do since it's in a table. You can obviously query, you can define a report in SQL Developer, for example, to have this information available. And underneath here, I mentioned all of the different objects or data elements that you get with it. You know, you can actually get like the Windows username if they're coming from a Windows client machine. Depending on, it sometimes depends on the client, the connection technology, right? If they're using SQLnet, you get a little more than just the JDBC thin connections. But in general, you get, you know, what user they were connected as, what host they were coming from, when they did an action, what they did if they created or dropped an object, what object were they working on, did they rename something if they're doing like new names and stuff. And even the if you turn on extended tracing, you can get the index creation for primary key, right, recursive stuff. So if I create a table to find with a primary key, sometimes you'll see the index creations follow on from that. So I really believe that this is a useful capability to have in terms of what you can see what's going on in your environment. And just for grins and chuckles, it's not just an Oracle thing. SQL Server, and this is dating me a little bit, but they've had DDL triggers since 2005. And I've got a reference here to a DDL audit solution presentation at one of the past conferences that talk about how you could use this capability in SQL Server. So I don't see any barrier to, no, I'm on SQL Server, I can't do this. I don't think so. I think there's a capability there. Same with MySQL. MySQL has a binary log that you can use to capture what's been going on in the system. DB2 has this capability. And I really like the fact, at least in Oracle, that it's table viewable. I have found places where you have to be, again, you have to talk to the security organization. In particular around Oracle's best practices often are to make the audit log not in the table in the database because they want to make sure that DBAs can't change the data that's in there. The good news is I think if you turn it on to OS and XML, it's only a view. It actually reads out from the file system. So the files are written out to the file system, the XML audit log is written, and it might be in a secure location where the DBA can't delete the files. But the $V view will read those files and allow you to see what happened, but it's not a table, so you can't go in and change it. So I think there are ways to skin this cat that allow best practice security in terms of the audit log, as well as giving me the information I'd like as a database development manager. So now I'm going to take a small break and just allow you guys to digest that a little bit and let you kind of think through some of the possibilities. Now that I've got, for every database that I'm working with, I have an actual log in the database of what was done to that database over time in terms of its structural changes. Now, in the development organization, I find this, you know, extremely valuable. I can, on a periodic basis, kind of define, look at how fast we're doing or how much work we've done in defining the data structures that people are using. So I can go in and say, all right, have we finished all the tables we said we were going to do for this sprint? You know, who was working on them? When did they do them? I can see who's working on which parts of the data model. I've got a larger data model. Who's working on which pieces? I may use this as an understanding of ways to keep my data model fresh. So, for example, I might reverse engineer stuff on a periodic basis into something like SQL Developer Data Modeler, so that I'm continuing to maintain a data model, or Irwin. I constantly use this as a reverse engineer my databases into my models, so I can visualize and draw them for the people who like to have the data models or checked into the corporate data model mart. I also like the capability here to use the automated capabilities in things like SQL Developer Data Model to ensure compliance. So one place I've seen that this really works well is in the past I've told people, well, why don't we let the developers create the tables or the database engineers create the tables, and then we'll periodically assess whether or not they're complying with our naming standards. And the data governance organization I've talked to says, no, we can't do that. We have to validate that they're adhering to naming standards before they can get started with development. And I asked them, I said, well, why is that? I mean, if the data naming standards are clear and they're easy for anyone to understand, then if I funnel them through one organization, I've created a bottleneck. I've created a delay gate. If I can give them to everybody and say, well, we're going to measure how well you adhere to them, then I've immediately increased my productivity there. Right? I let all my developers do their work, and then on a periodic basis, I assess their compliance with the naming standards. And I can do that in SQL Developer Data Modeler by reverse engineering into the model and running the compliance reports. And to me, that's a great use of a data governance person's time. That their job is to measure and assess compliance with standards, understand exceptions to standards, and basically, provide them with the tools to do this in a much more rapid fashion. And then finally, probably the most important thing is if we're doing a continuous integration or release cycle, how can I tell what's been changed since the last time we did a release? And this is where the audit log comes in real handy. I can basically say, show me every database change since this time period. I'd like to know exactly what's been changed since the last time we did a release. And what I would do at Network Solutions is I'd print that list, and I would sit down with my engineers, and I would walk through and say, does this need to go, 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 what was this for? And we basically justified every object and figured out whether or not it needed to be sent to the integration environment. And then if I have this in my integration environment, I like the fact that I can determine where changes came from. So in theory, I would do a build, I would create scripts, and I can do that in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's say I've created scripts that can be used to install changes into integration, and I hand them off to someone to run in an independent validation fashion, so somebody else runs them. And then I log into that system and I look at the audit log and I say, well, did all of my changes come from my scripts, or were there changes that came from somewhere else, and if so, where? Because I think I've talked to some of my friends who are really good at continuous integration and delivery, and they'll tell me that continuous delivery and continuous integration only really works well when the environments are the same, right? When production looks like development, then I can continuously deploy to it. The fact that I allow it to diverge significantly may cause failures in my continuous build process, and I want to avoid those. And I also think in the integration environment where we start to run some tests, I can start to see potential performance issues related to frequent DDL. If someone's built a process maybe in Ruby that is constantly building and dropping tables to do something, I'll uncover that here in integration because I'm tracking that, what I would call painful activity. And then very finally, I'd like to make sure that I then do a double check. Did everything I think was going to be installed actually get installed? And this is one place where I can get that list. You can do a lot of stuff with diff stuff as well, and I'll talk about that too. But I like having the thing I can print out. I can always query. I can always get a record of what was installed when. I can say at this day, at this time, these objects were created. And then finally, the last one is production. And this is a fascinating one for me because I found that probably 10% of the performance or production problems I've seen are often related to someone went in and dropped an index or created a table or did something, altered the system, and there's really no record of it. And that's really not the fault of anyone in particular. Maybe they were doing it in response to a request. But the bottom line is, we should know everything that's getting created in production. It should only be related to a release or a particular known requirement. So when you're doing root cause analysis of what occurred in the production database and you'd like to trace back to any potential changes, this is why I really like the DDL or structural audit log. I can see in production that, hey, yesterday Jim logged in and created an index on that table. I can definitely see that. And then also when we're doing a production deployment, it's similar to integration. Did everything I want to get installed in production actually go ahead and get installed? So I like having that audit log capability for production as well. So people tell me that looks great, but you really haven't told me anything about how this makes me be more agile. You're getting a good view of what's going on, perhaps in the environment, and maybe by allowing lots more people to do development, you're becoming more agile. But Are there other things I can do? How can I do this continuous integration or deployment thing you've talked about here? And more to the point, can I make sure that what I'm doing is in alignment with what my developer's doing? You know, they're doing a rapid development methodology. How do I align so that I'm speaking, you know, similar language so they don't laugh me out of the room when I go in to talk to them? Are there tools that kind of support that for me? This really gets down to the fact that in many cases, database development has some unique characteristics that are different than simple code. The bottom line is we basically have three things we want to keep in sync or synchronized. We have our database of record that we're doing development against. We have a data model that we have a requirement to produce for our data governance organization. And then we have build and deployment scripts that we want to have reflect the database as it is today and the set of changes we've made to that database over time. So we really want to ensure that all three of these areas are in sync, that if someone said to me, well, we've lost the database, I should be able to say, well, go to the deployment server or the build server, pull out all the scripts and rebuild it. That ought to be a no-brainer, but those need to be synchronized. Or someone says, well, I've looked at the data model and I don't see this data element, that should reflect what's in the database as well. All three of these things should be in lockstep in terms of what they reflect of the environment. One challenge I found, though, is that there are very few tool sets that handle all of these together. Toad and Toad Data Modeler with Schema Compare and the Toad source code control plugins comes close. It's not entirely an integrated environment, but in general, within one set of tools, you could potentially do all three. SQL Developer and SQL Developer Data Modeler combined with the SQL Developer source code extensions like for subversion and dimensions and their database diff capability will help you as well. Some tools do two of them really well. Irwin will do like the data model and database. DB Maestro, which is a small company in Israel, will do source code control on the database and the source code control management. There's an open source toolkit called Liquibase that can be used to build deployment scripts. You can always use good old SQL+, and Redgate makes the schema compare for Oracle, which will help you keep the database in sync and generate scripts for deployment as well. One thing I've found is that database to data model synchronization is really hard, two-way in particular, or the reverse engineering that I like to do from the database into the data model. Most data modeling tools assume a waterfall approach in which you complete your data model and then deploy, and they're relatively weak at integrating back-end changes from a database that's changed underneath a model. I've seen some neat things in SQL Developer Data Modeler for this, where they can do these kind of comparisons and show you, which side of the system is in out of sync, but it's a little clunky, I think. I'd like it to be better. Also, what I found is given the number of comparison tools that are out there, the creation of scripts that can be sent into or fed into a build process is weak. I found that most comparison tools believe that they generate and make changes immediately. They don't make the changes that can then be checked into source code control so that we have a better picture of how we deploy changes. They say go into the comparison tool and apply the changes in the other database to get them in sync. So I've been on a little crusade for probably the past, oh gosh, 2-3 years to get these comparison tools to produce script output that can be more amenable or useful when building a deployment or build process. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Actually, the one that's probably most interesting lately is I had a tweet conversation with Chris Rice, who's the development manager for SQL Developer, and they made a change to SQL Developer 3.1 in which when you do the schema compares, it used to produce one long script to change everything. And they've modified it now so that it generates a script per object and per change, similar to the way it does the unloads. So what I like about that is I can see, object by object, what's being changed. I can check those into source code control. I can do a little more granular control instead of having one monolithic script to do the change. So they just added that to 3.1 SQL Developer. So check that out. I like that a lot. I guess my point about this is, this gets back to some of my laziness comments from earlier, I like to generate this stuff as much as possible. I like to drive off the audit log to see what's been changed, or I like to use a comparison tool to see what's been changed. I really want to assist the ability to push changes into the upper level environments through automation. I don't want, and when I got to Network Solutions, when I started there, literally when we were done coding up the database to deploy to integration testing, there's another set of hand-coded scripts to deploy those changes. And I think that that's just inefficient. I want my folks focusing on development, not on deployment scripts. Those should be automated. The other reason I like automating or the generation of deployment scripts is I can actually inject features into those scripts. So for example, when I generate a deployment script, I might inject the source code control tags that I'm going to put into my source code control system. So if I can standardize how my scripts work, and that's what I get with a generation tool, I can possibly also standardize how I inject or require certain things to be in every script. So I've got my donut line here, and it talks about this automation thing. And basically what I'm going to put here, these are things I think you should be demanding from your tools vendors, that data modeling tools should be much more robust at handling reverse engineering on an iterative basis. And if you're doing, your tools need to become as agile as the method you're using. And that is when you're doing incremental refactoring of a database, how do I reflect those refactored changes into my data models? I mean, I guess a joke you'll hear from many places that the data model is out of date the day it's done. I don't like that. I think a data model is useful. It can be very important for folks to kind of get a good understanding and overview of the system. So how do I make it continually up to date? How do I make sure that it's always showing what's accurately in the system? And I want my data modeling tools to be much better at reverse engineering and what I call standards compliance reporting. How do I use a data modeling infrastructure to describe domain rules, naming standards, and use that to examine databases so that I can keep them in compliance and do that very rapidly? I shouldn't have to send a script to a data governance group and wait for them to review it by hand or by eye and see if I'm following a standard convention. The tools will do that. Let's make them do that and use them for that fashion. The second area is the database developer tools, and here we look at things like Toad and SQL Developer and Schema Compare. And how do I make sure those tools are providing me with the things I'd like to have? And do they have this visibility and alerting into what's going on? That social database aspect I mentioned before, where I can see that people are making changes to the system. Can my tool do that in a collaborative way? Can I have a little window on the right that shows me what's going on in the system? Jim logged on. He's running a query. He created a table. Can I subscribe to the flow of what Sally's doing in the database? How can I really watch what's going on so that I'm fully aware of how the system is evolving? I want that from my development tools. I think diff should be something you do every day. I used to do this at Network Solutions. I was religious about, I would diff the databases on a constant basis, and I would not allow changes or deltas. I mean, there was the fact that a system was different from another one. I wanted to eliminate every possible area of difference that could creep in. Even, I would use the same table space names in each environment. I would use auto-allocate storage clauses in every environment. What can I do to ensure that the environments are the same, right? When doing partitioning, I want the tables partitioned in development the same way they are in QA and the same way they are in production. Obviously, the partitions in production will be much larger. But if I tested a thing in development with 10 partitions, I want production to have 10 partitions. So this is really, to me, the way this can be done is if diff programs are easy to use, and SQL Compare or Schema Compare is a great example of this, you should run it regularly. Now, this does get into the issue of access. I've had many organizations say, well, we can't allow developers to access production, or we can't allow them to access QA. And diff, by its very nature, requires access to both systems, right? You need to examine the data dictionary from both systems to compare. But it might be possible, I know Schema Compare does this, where you can take a snapshot baseline of production and compare against that. So, if there are ways to do this that may assuage some of the security concerns, but at the end of the day, I think it's table stakes for me that your system should be exactly the same. Index names the same, column orders the same. There really are no good reasons why they should be any different. I've worked in systems where they've said, oh, it's okay that the column order is different in production than in development. And then, lo and behold, someone does a select star and the column order is different. And they'll say, well, that shouldn't have done that, or it shouldn't have made a difference. And to me, if someone says, well, that minor difference isn't important, I can guarantee that 6 months from now something will happen that was the difference that was an issue. So I think there's no reason why you shouldn't be constantly doing diffs, and it should be very easy to do in your tools. The last one here is the script generation thing. I think you ought to be able to take a checkpoint of where you are since the last time you've generated scripts and say, what is the set of changes I need to promote to other people or other environments so that I can synchronize or check in or merge what changes I've done. It's an interesting concept here. I didn't talk about it a heck of a lot, but in whether or not I allow developers to have their own databases or I have a centralized database that everyone works against, I don't particularly care one way or another. However, if I'm going to allow everybody to have a private database, I need this ability to determine what changes they've made to it and merge it back into a central database, just like code merging. So I think this is an evolving area for database development. I talked with Bryn Llewellyn from Oracle Development about addition-based redefinition and how they're looking at maybe including some of this capability in there as well, the merging capability and branching capability. So I'm excited to see that Oracle's thinking along these lines as well. And then in the last bit here, I think it behooves us as database professionals to start learning the language and tools that our corresponding developers are using. If they're using Git or Subversion for source code control and they want database scripts checked into there, we need to learn those things. We need to get smart on how those work. The good news is they're open source. You can download them. There are books on them. This isn't hard stuff. I encourage everyone to vote for the Git plugin for SQL Developer. I want to make sure that people are really trying to add that kind of capability in to the tools that are there. I look at the other tools as well, like Liquibase and Ant and Maven for building. I get familiar with things like Puppet and Chef for automated deployment. And I also really think as a DBA it's interesting to learn about Ruby and Rake because of the active record schema definition paradigm and the database migrations capability that Rake brings to the table. Finally here I have some suggested reading for database administrators. The book on the left probably began my journey into understanding how I could do Agile database development. And if you're familiar with the concept of refactoring in Agile, I think this is about the only book out there that talks about how to refactor a database so that you can constantly add changes to it. It's written by Scott Ambler and Pramod Sattelage. And Scott Ambler, for many of you know, is one of the folks around the Agile Manifesto. So I think this is quite a good book to read and understand. And I put the other two on here just as examples of things I think we need to get more smart on, and that's the active record paradigm, database development underneath Ruby on Rails, and then of course Git is what I'm seeing is replacing a lot of the Subversion stuff. And I think as I mentioned before, it's not database administrators, it's really database engineers. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes now where we can open it up for questions. I've got our contact information up here, mine up there on the top, and James down here as well as the offer that Redgate has for the development suite for Oracle at the bottom here. So with that, James, I'm going to open it up for questions and figure out how we're going to, I guess I can give the keyboard and mouse back to you.
Thanks, Dominic. So we have a few questions already within the questions console. So I'm going to start on these now. If you've got some questions, please type them into your question panel now, and we'll try and answer all the questions. So the first question we have here is from Sean Francis. Thank you, Sean. So Dominic, if you're suggesting the database and data model be kept synchronized, how do you reconcile it with allowing the developers to dream up the objects as they go in their development environment? Who is supposed to have the good discipline and responsibility of maintaining the data model?
It's a good question. One of the things I like about Agile development is its kind of collaborative nature and discussion. And at Network Solutions, with the database engineers and developers would actually sit down and discuss what are we trying to accomplish with the data. And what I like to do in that case is experiment a bit. How do I think about how I'm going to build the database structures and then reverse engineer? So it's really an iterative, collaborative approach in which the really, at the end of the day, it got interesting that my Java developers and Ruby developers got to the point where they were like, if you can create tables fast enough for us, we don't have to go ahead and do it. We trust you to do it. But at first, I really didn't clamp down. I said, you go ahead and get started, but you know what, I'm a lot faster at this. So it really came down to the fact that I was able to develop tables faster, changed the handover from control back over to the database professionals. But I was able to show them by basically saying, go ahead and do it. I'll reverse engineer and show you it. I'll show you what's wrong with it. I'll show you things you've missed. And after a while, they're like, oh, this is just too hard. If you can do it faster for me, please just go ahead and do it. So the real issue became the fact that they then trusted me to kind of do that control and make sure it was done correctly.
Thanks, Dominic. So another question here from Sean. Thank you, Sean. If you're only catching non-compliance or undesirable code at the integration stage, it's more than likely that a good chunk of already written functionality is now dependent on that. Thus, the developers often fall through what they want to the detriment of the integrity of the production systems. They're not responsible for those they often don't care. How do you suggest this be avoided?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I talked about having that audit capability in development, and I honestly, I don't want to wait till integration to check compliance. What I've talked about with data governance organizations is literally the development database is wide open for you to run your compliance checks, and I think you should do those daily. When you talk to some people doing continuous integration, continuous development, they want to do a build daily. So I encourage, we may not be able to do a build daily, but I encourage compliance checking daily, right? So first thing in the morning, how many things were created yesterday, and are they all compliant? And if they aren't, the good news with the audit trail is I know who did it. So and hopefully I can either pick up the phone and talk with them about it, or better yet, walk down the hall or walk around the corner and say, hey, wait, this table's not going to make it to integration. You can't do it this way. So I encourage that level of examination and visibility early on, which is funny because many of the Agile developers will tell you they love collaboration and visibility, except when it comes to the other people looking at their code. But the really good mature developers really welcome the fact that, oh, you caught a problem early for me, thank you, and what should I have done differently? So I encourage that checking very early on, not waiting till integration.
Thanks, Dominic. So the next question is from Matthew Springer. Thank you, Matthew. Is there a graphical deployment tool to deploy the new code changes in the build development database?
I don't know of one. If there is one, if someone knows of one, please let me know. I would love to evaluate one to see that. I think it's a really unique and interesting area of research that could be done, but I don't know of one. I've been doing this by scripts and by hand, and although the diff stuff are getting better, I found that I'm getting to the point where I'm hoping to abandon my script-based approach in favor of something like schema compare or SQL developer diff, which will really kind of net it out for me what's going to happen in terms of the deployment, where it's going to check it in, it's going to kick off a Maven job or an Ant job to do the build. I'm excited that hopefully that's coming soon. I don't see it there yet.
Thanks, Dominic. Matthew, I would certainly recommend checking out the Refactoring deployment tools. They do offer a graphical way of looking at the differences between schemas and table data, and then the tool itself can automate updating one database with the contents of another database.
Yeah, sweet.
We've got a number of comments in here. Please put in your comments. I'll certainly forward these to Dominic, and they're very useful for us to hear as well. But for the purpose of this session, we're just answering questions. So if you do have any questions, please can you type them into the question panel now. Okay, if there are no more questions, we are going to wrap up. But if you do have something you'd like to ask Dominic, either about the presentation content or database development or agile development in general, that's obviously a very good opportunity to be able to do that. We just had a question in from Roy Helinga. Thank you, Roy. So this is a comment, Dominic, about managing testing data. How would you manage test data?
That's a really good question. Test data is a very interesting topic in several areas. I know that the Redgate tools will synchronize data in addition to structures. I know that you want to look for tools that can do that capability. It can be expensive, and it's interesting to describe what kind of testing data you're looking at. I know also that SQL Developer does PL SQL unit testing, where it can kind of do scaffold work, stand up a table, populate it with data, run a test of a set of assertions, and then tear it down. In my environment at Network Solutions, we actually would do a couple things for testing. Among them, we would copy into the QA environment, we'd copy full copy production data, and that was really to get volume in place. And then once that was in place, they would run test data generation scripts on top of that. So our process really was repeatable in that what we would do on a regular basis was refresh testing databases downward from production and then run repeatable scripts to create testing data. That was generally also that stuff was checked in source code control. So we would say, okay, now that we would set up our special test cases on top of the production data, and we did that for obviously to get repeatable test cases. But we liked having the production data kind of underneath it because of the data volume issues that I think really affect performance significantly and may cause you to change your data structures. So I'm a big fan of wherever possible having as much production data downward in other environments. There are issues around decrypting and encrypting in different environments. There's a company in California called Delphix that I've been watching with some interest because they have this capability of essentially staging a production volume in development, but not with all of the volume. Kyle Haley from Oaktable works there, and I've been impressed with what I think they can do, but I haven't had a chance to really drive into them a lot. But I think that's basically my feeling on testing data.
Thanks, Dominic. Okay, Roy continues on this theme. What about the issue of changing the structure while they're with test data existing? Do you have any tips for people on that?
Yeah, so the question again is about changing structure in the face of existing data, and that's an interesting concept because a lot of people forget this, that a lot of developers will say, well, we just want to add this field. And I say, okay, well, old data, how should it be rendered or represented with this new column? Is it a default value? Is it generated off of something that's in the row? So I need to probably manually create those data migration scripts, if you will, that allow you to transform the test data from one release to a new structure. And of course, this depends a lot on the extent to which the structure has changed. But a lot of times I've found too, you can, especially if you're doing this is why again I like production volume in test environments. I have to deal with that production volume. Can I pre-convert data? Can I look at historical data that isn't going to be changed and set up a staging area where I ahead of time deploy a database or data transformation script so that the data is being transferred before I have to do my cutover or my deployment. So I think you do have to concern yourself with that and identify structural changes that then require changes to data in place. There are also new structures that require data themselves, where you might stand up a new reference table and have a list of 100 new reference values. Those insert statements or those have to be captured, checked into source code control, and used as a deployment when standing up that new table. So I think it's not only test data, but I actually look at this more from the perspective of managing the production data volumes. How do I deal with the fact that there's existing data? How do I have to transform it? And then is there anything in possibly I can do to pre-deploy? Because one of the things I like about this process is the ability to do zero downtime type deployments, right? I want to deploy frequently. I want to deploy often. So how do I do that in such a way that I don't have to take downtime? And a lot of that means, especially with pre-existing data, that I have to do pre-deployment of data data conversions, data transformation? Good question.
Thanks, Dominic. Okay, so there are no more questions. You've got both of our contact details on the screen in front of you. If you do think of something after this session, you think that you wish you'd ask Dominic, or you want to put some questions to myself, please either contact us by email, by Twitter. It'd be great to follow us as well, and you can also get in touch with me via LinkedIn. So I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you to Dominic for presenting this session, and of course thank you to everybody for attending it. I do hope it was useful for you, and as mentioned before, a recording of this webinar, including the Q&A, will be made available in the next day or so. So thank you very much for joining us.